I knew something was wrong the moment three men in cheap uniforms marched up my driveway, flashing fake badges and calling themselves HOA compliance officers. They weren't here to talk about lawn height or mailbox paint. They were here to arrest me. The problem? They didn't know I was an FBI agent. I played along, letting them rattle off bogus violations while my eyes tracked the black SUV idling at the curb, tinted windows, engine running, and the man watching from inside? A face I recognized from bureau files, a Mafia boss with a federal bounty on his head. The HOA wasn't just power tripping, they were running cover for organized crime. And that night, when they tried to drag me into their little empire, I caught them red-handed. This is the story of how a crooked HOA tried to take me down, and how I brought their entire Mafia-backed operation to its knees. Want to hear the full story? Buckle up. This one gets wild. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The first time I suspected something was wrong with our HOA, it wasn't because of the usual petty letters about lawn height or trash bins being left out a little too long. No, it started with a visit, a late evening knock on my door that sounded more like a police raid than a neighborly complaint. I opened the door to find three of them standing on my porch, clipboards in hand, smug expressions plastered across their faces. They were dressed a little too neatly, almost like they wanted to give off an air of authority. The one in the middle, a wiry man with slicked-back hair, immediately announced, "We're here on behalf of the HOA Compliance Board, and you are in violation of several community rules." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. If only they knew who they were talking to. On the surface, I'm just another quiet resident of a suburban neighborhood, the kind of guy who pays his dues on time and keeps his lawn trimmed enough to avoid attention. But behind that facade, I wear a badge they could only dream of flashing: FBI Special Agent. Of course, they didn't need to know that. Not yet. I leaned casually against the doorframe, glancing at their clipboards. Really? What kind of violations are we talking about? The slick-haired one smirked, flipping through his papers as though he had a dossier on me. Non-regulation blinds in your upstairs windows, a shed that appears to be larger than HOA allowance, and suspicious traffic coming in and out of your driveway. He raised an eyebrow as if daring me to explain myself. Now, the blinds and shed accusation was laughable. I'd double-checked all those dimensions when I moved in. But the suspicious traffic? That one sent a ripple of caution through me. They had been watching me, which meant these people weren't just nosy, they were observant, maybe too observant. Suspicious traffic? I echoed slow. Sully, my tone calm. You mean my nephew dropping off his kids for the weekend? The woman on the left, a sharp-eyed brunette with an expression like she'd smelled something foul, crossed her arms. Don't play dumb. We've seen the cars, dark windows, late-night arrivals, and people who don't look like they belong here. This neighborhood is supposed to be safe. I gave her a tight smile. Well, I appreciate your concern, but unless the HOA has suddenly been deputized, I don't think my visitors are any of your business. Their faces tightened at that, and I could see the simmering frustration behind their fake professionalism. They wanted me to push back harder so they could escalate, but I'd been in far tougher interrogations than this, and I knew how to play the long game. Look, the slick-haired one said finally, his voice dropping a notch lower, almost conspiratorial. We just want to make sure everyone in this community is cooperating. People who don't cooperate often find themselves paying more fines than they can handle. Sometimes they even find themselves in legal trouble. The threat was clear, and the way he said legal trouble sent a spark of recognition through me. That wasn't standard HOA bluster. That was leverage talk, the kind of language I'd heard from extortionists, not suburban board members. I pretended to sigh, feigning resignation. All right, I'll review the bylaws again. Maybe I missed something. That seemed to satisfy them enough for now. They exchanged smug looks. Then the slick-haired one gave me a little nod. Good. We'll be in touch. When they finally left, I closed the door and leaned against it, my mind racing. HOA officers don't tail residents. They don't talk about cooperation like it's a mob shakedown, and they sure as hell don't know about my late-night visitors, fellow agents reporting for quiet, off-the-books meetings about an ongoing investigation, which meant only one thing. The HOA was watching me. And if they were watching me this closely, I had to wonder what or who were they really working for. The next few days, I kept my routine deliberately boring. I mowed the lawn at predictable hours, waved politely at neighbors, and drove to the grocery store for the kind of mundane purchases that would bore even the most determined busybody. On the surface, I looked like exactly what they thought I was supposed to be. A middle-aged homeowner with nothing more dangerous on his mind than weeds and grocery coupons. But underneath, my instincts were on high alert. I started noticing details I'd missed before. A gray sedan that parked just down the street a little too often. A neighbor across the cul-de-sac suddenly interested in sitting on his porch every evening with binoculars disguised as bird watching. The HOA had surveillance patterns, and not amateur ones either. Their rotations were organized. They weren't watching the neighborhood, they were watching me. At the Bureau, we call that counter-surveillance. And that's not something a bunch of HOA volunteers should even know how to pull off. I decided to run a small test. That night, I staged a decoy drop. I had a fellow agent swing by in an unmarked vehicle, hand me a brown paper bag, and leave without saying a word. Inside the bag was nothing more than bagels from a local bakery. But it didn't matter. I wanted to see who reacted. Sure enough, less than an hour later, the gray sedan eased by my driveway, headlights dimmed. I stood behind my living room curtain, watching it crawl past like a shark circling bait. The driver didn't stop, but he didn't have to. Message received, they were monitoring every move. The real question was why. I started digging, quietly. Officially, I was still on leave, recovering from a long-term undercover operation. But unofficially, I had resources, a few late-night encrypted calls to bureau contacts, some queries into local property records, and a pull on financial filings tied to the HOA. What I found made my stomach tighten. The HOA's budget didn't make sense. Annual dues collected should have been just enough to cover maintenance, security lights, landscaping contracts, but the numbers showed a surplus, an enormous one. Hundreds of thousands of dollars unaccounted for, funneled through shell maintenance companies with vague names like Green Horizon Services and Unified Community Solutions. Companies that, as far as I could tell, didn't exist outside of paperwork. Classic laundering fronts. If the HOA was involved in money laundering, that meant they weren't just petty tyrants with clipboards. They were gatekeepers for something much bigger. And given the way they tried to intimidate me, I had a feeling they weren't the ones at the top of the food chain. They were middlemen, watchdogs for someone who valued control over this quiet little suburb. That suspicion hardened into near certainty when I spotted the slick-haired man again 2 nights later. He wasn't alone this time. He was standing in the shadows near the community clubhouse talking to someone who didn't belong here, a thick-set man in an expensive tailored suit, the kind you don't wear to a neighborhood meeting. I recognized the type immediately, the arrogance in his stance, the dismissive flick of his hand as he spoke, the predatory sharpness in his eyes. I'd spent years chasing men like him, organized crime. I pulled out my phone and zoomed in, snapping a blurry photo through the clubhouse window. It wasn't great evidence, but it was enough to start building a case, enough to send a shiver of adrenaline down my spine. The HOA wasn't just working with a mafia boss. They were protecting him. And now, I had to decide my next move carefully. If I pushed too fast, they'd know who I really was. If I waited too long, I risked losing the trail. Either way, one thing was certain. And this quiet little suburb had just become the center of a war zone, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The following morning, the neighborhood looked deceptively normal. Joggers trotted down the sidewalks. Kids on bikes squealed past my house. Sprinklers hissed across perfect lawns. It was a postcard of suburban peace. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, I knew there were cracks, dark channels where money, power, and fear flowed unchecked. The HOA officers were the smiling faces, the Mafia their muscle, and the entire neighborhood their cover. I needed intel, something solid, something that could tie them together in a way no defense lawyer could wriggle out of, and for that, I had to get inside their world without tipping my hand. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That evening, I found a neatly folded letter shoved into my mailbox. It wasn't the usual typed HOA violation form. It was handwritten in the slick-haired man's confident script. Mandatory compliance review, community clubhouse, Friday, 8 p.m., attendance required. No signature, no HOA logo, just an instruction, the kind that reeked of arrogance. It wasn't a meeting, it was a summons. Perfect. Friday night, I showed up in the kind of clothes they expected. Khakis, polo shirt, nothing that screamed federal agent. I slipped my bureau-issued Glock into a discreet ankle holster just in case, but otherwise kept my appearance disarmingly bland. The clubhouse was dimly lit, the blinds drawn tight. Inside, half a dozen HOA officers sat around a long table, papers and folders spread out like it was some kind of board meeting. But it wasn't the paperwork that caught my eye. It was the man at the head of the table, the Mafia boss. Up close, he was even more imposing, broad shoulders stretching the seams of his suit, gold watch gleaming under the fluorescence, a face carved into a permanent sneer. His eyes locked onto me the moment I walked in, sharp and calculating. "This the new guy?" he asked, his voice gravel wrapped in silk. Slick hair smirked. "The one we told you about, doesn't like to cooperate." The boss leaned back in his chair, studying me the way a lion studies prey. "Doesn't like to cooperate, huh?" He let the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. I forced a chuckle, slipping into the role of reluctant neighbor. "Look, I just don't appreciate people showing up at my house unannounced. If there's rules, fine, just don't treat me like a criminal for having guests." The boss's lips curled into something between a smile and a warning. "Fair enough. But you should understand something, neighbor. This community doesn't run on rules alone. It runs on respect. You respect us. You get to live in peace. You don't—" He snapped his fingers, and one of the officers immediately leaned forward, scribbling something on a notepad. I caught a glimpse, my address, circled twice. That wasn't an idle threat. That was a mark. I kept my breathing steady, every nerve on edge. I couldn't blow my cover here, not yet. Instead, I nodded slowly, as though conceding the point. "All right, respect, got it." The boss smiled thinly, satisfied. "Good. Then we won't have any problems." The rest of the meeting was little more than a shakedown disguised as community planning. They discussed fines, not as penalties for violations, but as quotas, ways to bleed certain residents dry until they either paid up or moved out. They talked about contracts with maintenance companies that didn't exist, about security patrols that were nothing more than enforcers keeping everyone in line. By the time it ended, I had heard enough to confirm what I already suspected. The HOA was nothing more than a laundering machine, a facade for organized crime operations. As I left the clubhouse, the boss's gaze followed me all the way to the door. I could feel the weight of it, a silent warning that I was under his microscope now. What he didn't know was that the feeling was mutual, because now I had more than suspicion. I had infiltration, and I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was their newest member, which meant I was close enough to bring the whole operation crashing down. The weekend after that meeting, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that Mafia boss's stare, the kind that strips you down to bone, measuring whether you're prey or predator. He had bought the HOA's loyalty, but I suspected that wasn't all. Something told me this community was more than just a convenient laundering spot. The scale of it, the organization, the money flows, it felt like a hub. I needed hard evidence. The clubhouse was the obvious place to start. That's where they gathered, where records were kept, where I'd already witnessed the Mafia boss in play. But walking back in there uninvited would be suicide. I had to wait for the right moment. That moment came Sunday evening. The community newsletter said the clubhouse would be hosting a family movie night out on the lawn, with most of the officers present, which meant the building itself would be relatively empty. I parked my car a block away, dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, blending in with shadows. My bureau training kicked in: check corners, control breathing, move with purpose. The clubhouse door was locked, but locks are only obstacles if you're unprepared. My pick set slid into the cylinder, and within seconds I was inside, greeted by the faint smell of old coffee and printer ink. The office was exactly where I'd expected it, down the hall, door labeled "Board Members Only." Inside, I found rows of filing cabinets, boxes stacked with receipts, contracts, invoices, perfect cover for dirty money. I pulled out my phone, snapping photo after photo, scanning documents under the faint glow of my flashlight. It didn't take long to find what I needed: a series of maintenance invoices, for landscaping projects that never happened, payments routed to accounts overseas, and tucked behind one ledger, a thick envelope of cash, rubber-banded and marked with initials. Sloppy. Too sloppy for a real corporate front. This was old-school laundering. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a folder marked with my street address. Inside were surveillance notes, handwritten logs of who came and went from my house, what cars were parked nearby, even details about the nights I thought I hadn't been followed. They knew far too much. I slipped the folder into my hoodie, planning to get it out for analysis later. But as I turned to leave, I heard voices. The door to the building opened, footsteps echoing down the hallway. Too early. Movie night should still be running. I killed my flashlight and flattened myself against the wall, listening. "Boss said he wants the next payment cleared by tomorrow," one voice muttered. "Yeah, and if that neighbor doesn't play ball soon, we'll make him," another replied. The footsteps grew louder, heading straight for the office. My heart hammered, but I forced calm into my veins. Panic gets you caught, patience gets you out. The knob rattled. I slid silently behind a tall filing cabinet as the door opened. Two men walked in, HOA officers, one of them the sharp-eyed brunette from before. She dropped a stack of folders onto the desk with a sigh. I barely breathed as they shuffled papers, oblivious to me crouched in the shadows. After a tense 5 minutes, they finally left, locking the door behind them. I waited until silence settled again before slipping out the way I came, adrenaline surging through me like fire. By the time I reached my car, my pulse had steadied. I had evidence in my pocket, surveillance notes, forged contracts, financial trails, enough to spark a federal case. But it wasn't enough to take Dowdas and the boss. Not yet, and I knew one thing for certain. If they were already this suspicious of me, my cover wouldn't last much longer. The war between me and this crooked HOA had just gone from quiet to personal. I spent the next morning combing through the stolen documents at my kitchen table, blinds drawn tight, coffee growing cold beside me. The folder on my address was the most damning. They had logged not just the times agents had dropped by, but also partial license plates. One entry even mentioned possible law enforcement connection. That chilled me. If the Mafia boss had even an inkling I wasn't just another homeowner, the whole operation could collapse, and I'd be marked for elimination. Still, there were cracks I could exploit. The invoices I photographed were sloppy, handwritten in some places, stamped in others. The shell companies funneled money overseas, but the transfers weren't masked well. Someone in the organization was cutting corners, relying on intimidation more than finesse. That was exploitable. By afternoon, I placed a coded call to one of my bureau contacts. The conversation was vague enough to sound like small talk to anyone listening, but she understood. Within days, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit would be digging into Green Horizon Services and Unified Community Solutions. My job, meanwhile, was to stay embedded and gather the kind of first-hand evidence no paper trail could provide. That night, the HOA made its next move. I was hauling trash to the curb when a black SUV rolled slowly down my street. Tinted windows, chrome rims, engine purring like a predator. It stopped in front of my driveway, and the passenger side window slid down. The Mafia boss himself leaned out, cigar smoke curling into the cool night air. "Nice neighborhood, huh?" he said, his voice casual but laced with menace. I tightened my grip on the trash can handle. "It's quiet, that's why I moved here." He smirked, flashing gold rings. "Quiet's good. Quiet means no problems, but sometimes, nay, bores don't understand how things work. And problems, they make noise." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Delivered face to face, no middlemen this time. I played the part of uneasy but submissive resident. "Look, I'm not looking for trouble. If it's about the HOA, I'll pay my dues, follow the rules. I just want to be left alone." The boss studied me, eyes like drills. For a moment, I wondered if he'd call my bluff, peel back my cover right there. Instead, he gave a curt nod. "Good. Then we'll have no issues." The window slid up, and the SUV rolled off, taillights glowing red as it disappeared into the night. I stood there long after he was gone, every muscle taut. That wasn't just a warning. That was him staking his claim, showing me that in his eyes, this wasn't my neighborhood. It was his territory. Back inside, I jotted every detail into my encrypted notes. Time, vehicle, dialogue, demeanor. It would be crucial later. But more than that, it was personal now. He had come to my doorstep, tested me, tried to mark me as just another pawn in his game. What he didn't know was that I wasn't a pawn. I was the one building the trap. The next step was riskier. If I wanted to catch them red-handed, I couldn't just wait for another meeting. I had to insert myself deeper, make them think I was pliable enough to trust. The closer I got, the more dangerous it would become, but also, the better my shot at tearing this whole empire down. I stared at the folder on my table, their notes on me staring back. They thought they were watching me, but soon I'd be watching them. From the inside, the following week, the HOA called for another mandatory meeting at the clubhouse. This one was framed as a discussion about new security measures, but I knew better. Security, in their language, didn't mean neighborhood watch signs and streetlights. It meant control. When I arrived, the mood was different from last time. Tighter, more serious. The slick-haired officer greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, gesturing toward a seat near the end of the table. The Mafia boss was there again, lounging like a king among peasants, a tumbler of whiskey in hand. "Tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "we discuss loyalty." The word hung heavy in the air. The officers nodded like obedient schoolchildren, but I could feel the tension. This wasn't a routine gathering. This was a test. The boss's gaze swept the table, finally landing on me. "Our little community works because everyone plays their part, but sometimes outsiders forget that. Sometimes they need encouragement." He snapped his fingers, and one of the officers slid a folder down the table toward me. I opened it and found photographs. Not of me this time, but of another resident, a middle-aged man who lived 2 streets over. Nice guy, always waved when he jogged by. The photos showed him talking to a police officer, paying bills at a bank, and entering his home at night. Surveillance. "He's been asking too many questions about dues," the boss said smoothly. "We don't like questions. You understand?" I forced myself to nod, flipping through the photos as if weighing what they wanted me to do. Inside, my stomach churned. They were pulling me in deeper, seeing how far I'd go. This was the moment they were trying to convert me from a potential nuisance into an accomplice. "What exactly do you want?" I asked carefully. The slick-haired man leaned forward, his grin sharp. "Jotaro, just a conversation. You pay him a visit, remind him to stop digging, make him understand this neighborhood is better when people keep quiet." Every instinct screamed at me to blow my cover, to tell them I was FBI, to end this charade right there. But blowing up too soon would only cut off the head of the snake without killing the body. I needed the whole operation. So I gave a slow nod, sliding the folder shut. "All right, I'll talk to him." The boss's smile widened, satisfied. "Good man. I knew you'd see things our way." The rest of the meeting blurred into more talk about projects, thinly veiled code for laundering routes. When it finally ended, I walked out with the folder under my arm, feeling the weight of both victory and danger pressing down on me. Back home, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk staring at the resident's photo. He had no idea how close he was to becoming collateral damage in a war he didn't even know existed. I couldn't let that happen. By dawn, I had a plan. I'd visit him, just as they asked, but not to intimidate, to protect. I would warn him discreetly, convince him to keep his head down, and quietly extract any information he might have stumbled across. At the same time, I'd use the opportunity to feed the HOA exactly what they wanted, a report that would make me look like I'd played along. It was dangerous. One misstep, and both of us could end up on the wrong side of a shallow grave. But that's the cost of playing undercover in the lion's den, and I had no intention of backing out now. I waited until evening before making my move. Broad daylight would have been too conspicuous. Neighbors watching from porches, HOA eyes everywhere. Under cover of darkness, though, I could keep control of the narrative. The resident's house was quiet when I pulled up, porch light casting a weak glow across his driveway. I carried the folder, though. I had given me, making sure it was visible, in case anyone happened to be watching. The trick was to look like I was following orders, even when I wasn't. He answered the door cautiously, peering through the chain lock. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion when he recognized me. Um, hey, can I help you? Yeah, I said, pitching my voice low but firm. We need to talk. It's about the HOA. That got his attention. He hesitated, then unlatched the chain and let me in. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. The TV muted in the background. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his hands. What's this about? He asked. I set the folder on his kitchen table, sliding the photos out. They've been watching you, every move you make. Bank, cops, even your nightly jog. You've drawn attention, and attention around here is dangerous. His face paled as he flipped through the pictures. What the hell? I just asked about why our dues went up again. I didn't do anything wrong. That doesn't matter, I said. To them, questions equal problems, and problems get silenced. He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the window as if expecting someone to be out there listening. So, what happens now? I leaned in closer, keeping my tone measured. Here's what you're going to do. Stop asking questions. Don't talk to cops. Don't mention dues. Don't breathe a word about this to anyone, not even your family. You keep your head down, you'll stay off their radar. Understand? He nodded quickly, relief and fear mixing on his face. Yeah, okay, I'll keep quiet. Good. I slid the photos back into the folder. As far as they're concerned, we had this conversation and you got the message. If they ask, you play along. Got it? Another quick nod. Satisfied, I stood and headed for the door. But just as I reached it, he spoke again, his voice low and urgent. Wait, you should know something. A few weeks ago, I saw them, some of the board members, meeting late at night near the storage units by the back gate. They were unsaw, loading crates from a truck, not landscaping equipment, something else. I froze, my pulse quickening. What kind of crates? He shook his head. Couldn't tell. Too dark, but they were heavy. Took two guys to carry each one, and they had armed guards watching the whole time. That was the lead I needed. Whatever was in those crates, it wasn't lawnmowers or fertilizer. That was product, guns, drugs, contraband. The HOA wasn't just laundering money, they were running distribution. I left his house with the folder tucked under my arm and my mind racing. The Mafia boss was using this neighborhood as a front, and those storage units were his pipeline. If I could catch them moving product, I'd have the evidence to bury him for good. But that meant going deeper, closer, into the belly of the beast. And if I wasn't careful, I might not come back out. The storage units became my new focus. From the outside, they looked ordinary enough. Row after row of metal roll-up doors, rented out to residents who needed extra space for holiday decorations or lawn equipment. But now I knew better. These weren't just storage lockers. They were warehouses for organized crime, disguised under the HOA's watchful eye. For 3 nights straight, I surveilled them from a distance. I parked 2 blocks away with a clear line of sight, binoculars resting on the dash. Nothing, just silence, the occasional raccoons scuttling across the pavement. By the 4th night, I began to wonder if the resident's tip was a fluke. Then, just past midnight, a truck rumbled up to the gate. Not a moving van, not a delivery truck. A cargo truck, unmarked, its engine low and menacing. 2 SUVs followed close behind, headlights dimmed. My pulse spiked. This was it. The gate slid open without a keypad code. Someone inside had triggered it remotely. The convoy slipped in like a snake slithering into its burrow. I checked my recorder, making sure the feed was running, then zoomed in with the binoculars. Men jumped out of the SUVs, guns slung casually over their shoulders. Enforcers. They surrounded the truck as it backed into one of the units. The roll-up door lifted, and for a brief moment I saw inside. Crates. Dozens of them stacked in neat rows. The men worked fast, unloading, stacking, sealing, efficient, practiced. This wasn't the first time they'd done this. And then I saw him, the Mafia boss himself, standing just outside the unit, cigar glowing in the dark. He supervised with the calm authority of a man who owned the world around him. Beside him stood the slick-haired HOA officer, clipboard in hand, jotting notes as though this was just another line item on a community budget. That image burned itself into my brain, the boss and the HOA officer, side by side, orchestrating crime under the guise of suburban order. I snapped photo after photo, careful not to let my lens reflect. This was the red-handed evidence I needed, but just as I adjusted focus for another shot, a pair of headlights flared in my rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. A car had pulled up behind me, engine idling, lights fixed directly on my vehicle. Too close, too deliberate. I cursed under my breath, reaching for my Glock. My cover wasn't blown yet, but if the wrong set of eyes peered into my windshield, it would be. I started the engine, forcing calm into my movements, and pulled forward slowly. The car behind me didn't move, just sat there, watching. Finally, after a minute that felt like an hour, it reversed and drove off, taillights vanishing into the dark. A warning, not an accident. Someone knew I was sniffing around. I couldn't linger. I fired off one last burst of photos and drove away, heart hammering. Back at my house, I spread the pictures across my table. The crates, the armed guards, the Mafia boss, the HOA officer. It was all there. Enough to kickstart a full-scale federal raid. But I wasn't ready to hand it over yet, not until I understood exactly what was in those crates. Drugs, weapons, something worse. Because whatever it wasn't just business. It was big. And if I wanted to bring this empire down, I had to know everything, which meant I'd have to get inside one of those storage units myself. Breaking into a Mafia-controlled storage unit isn't the kind of thing you do on impulse. One wrong move and I'd wind up zipped in a bag, dumped in a river before sunrise. But the photos I'd taken weren't enough. The Bureau needed to know what was inside those crates, and so did I. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I drove by the facility at different hours, noting guard rotations, traffic patterns, even the blind spots between security cameras. The HOA had wired the place tight, but not tight enough for someone with my training. On the third night, I made my move. Midnight, moonless sky, black clothes blending with the shadows. I parked my car several blocks away and slipped through a gap in the fence I'd scouted earlier. My lockpicks worked quickly on the nearest unit, but I wasn't after a random locker. I wanted the one I'd seen the truck back into. Row by row, I crept silently, every crunch of gravel underfoot sounding like a gunshot in my ears. Finally, I found it. Unit 47. A faint smell leaked from it, metallic and acrid, like oil and gunpowder. My instincts screamed weapons. I knelt at the lock, tools ready. That's when I heard it. The crunch of boots on gravel, slow and deliberate. My blood froze. Someone was patrolling. I slid behind a neighboring unit, Glock in hand, breath shallow. A flashlight beam cut across the rows, sweeping lazily. A guard. Not HOA this time. Too professional, too steady. This was one of the Mafia's hired men. He passed close, so close I could hear the click of his lighter as he lit a cigarette. Smoke drifted into the night air. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, until finally his steps faded down the row. Only then did I move again, fast and precise. The lock gave way with a quiet snap. I eased the door up just enough to slip inside, then pulled it shut behind me. Pitch black. I clicked on a tiny pen light, the beam revealing stacked crates from floor to ceiling. Each was stamped with a code and a symbol I recognized instantly. An international arms manufacturer that had been on the Bureau's radar for years. I pried one crate open with my knife, heart thudding. Inside, rifles. Not hunting rifles. Military-grade assault weapons, packed in neat foam. Enough firepower to supply a small army. I took photos, documenting everything. Serial numbers, crate markings, contents. Then I found something worse. At the back of the unit, beneath a tarp, sat several smaller boxes. I peeled one open and froze. Stacks of uncut narcotics, bricks wrapped tight, marked with cartel insignias. It wasn't just guns, it was drugs too. This neighborhood was a major distribution hub, a pipeline running right under everyone's noses. The HOA wasn't laundering money for the Mafia. They were laundering empires. Suddenly, the faint creak of metal made me snap my head up. The door was moving. Someone was opening it from the outside. I killed the light, crouching low, Glock raised. Shadows spilled across the floor as the door lifted higher. Voices drifted in. Two men, laughing quietly. Boss wants the next shipment out by dawn, one said. Yeah, well, he can haul it himself next time, the other grumbled. They stepped inside, flashlights sweeping over the crates. I pressed myself against the far wall, silent, every nerve stretched to breaking. If either of them turned just a few degrees more, as the beam would hit me, and then the whole operation would come crashing down. Tonight. The flashlight beam skimmed dangerously close to my face. I held my breath, Glock steady, every instinct screaming to fire first and clean up the mess later. But I couldn't. One shot would echo through the whole compound, and backup would swarm in before I could even slip out. This had to be silent. The two men muttered to each other as they checked the crates. One tapped a box with his boot. That's the last of it. Boss said no mistakes this time. Yeah, like it's our fault he's running guns and powder through a suburb, the other snorted. I filed that away. Resentment in the ranks, useful leverage for later. But right now, survival came first. As their backs turned, I moved. Quiet as a shadow, I crept along the wall until I was behind them. The first man leaned over a crate, flashlight in one hand, clipboard in the other. I struck fast, my arm snaking around his throat. Glock pressed hard against his ribs. He didn't even have time to gasp before I dragged him backward into the shadows. The second man spun, flashlight jerking. What the? I lunged forward, slamming the Glock's butt into his temple. He crumpled with a grunt, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence, just the sound of my own breathing in the dark. I bound their wrists with zip ties from my pocket, gagged them with scraps of tarp, and stashed them behind a stack of crates. They'd wake up eventually, but by then, I'd be long gone. Before leaving, I snapped a few more photos, this time of the men themselves, their faces clear under the harsh beam of my penlight. The Bureau would want to identify them later. I slipped out of the unit, closing the lock as best I could without raising suspicion. The compound was still alive with faint movement, distant guards making their rounds. I ducked low, hugging the shadow, and retraced my path to the gap in the fence. Every step felt like a mile, every noise like an alarm bell. Finally, I made it back to my car, adrenaline still pounding in my veins. I drove off without headlights until I was clear of the neighborhood, then pulled over under a dead street lamp to breathe. What I had just seen changed everything. This wasn't a small-time laundering scheme. This was a full-blown distribution hub for weapons and narcotics, run out of the HOA's backyard. The Mafia boss wasn't just using the officers as cover. He was embedding his entire empire into the community's infrastructure. I sent a coded update to my bureau contact with the photos attached. But even as I did, a thought gnawed at me. The Mafia wouldn't keep product in one place for long. If I had stumbled into a transfer window, the crates might already be on their way out by the time a raid was greenlit. Which meant I needed more than evidence. I needed timing. And the only way to get that was to earn the boss's trust enough for him to tell me himself. Dangerous? Absolutely. But I had no choice. To bring this empire down, I had to step fully into their world and pray I could step back out again. The morning after my break-in, I tried to act like nothing had happened. To anyone watching, I was just another neighbor sipping coffee on my porch, scrolling through my phone, pretending life was normal. Inside, though, my nerves were strung tight. The images of those crates, guns, drugs, power in its rawest form, burned in my mind. I didn't have long to wait before the HOA made their next move. Around noon, the sharp-eyed brunette officer strolled up my driveway, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking on the pavement. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that could cut glass. "Morning," she said brightly. "Routine compliance check. You don't mind, do you?" I gave her a half-smile back. "Sure, I've got nothing to hide." Her eyes flicked over my lawn, my porch, my house, though we both net. This wasn't about weeds or paint colors. She was studying me. Finally, she lowered her voice. "The boss wants to see you. Tonight. Clubhouse. 8 o'clock. And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving the message hanging in the air like a storm cloud. That night, the clubhouse lights burned low. Inside, the Mafia boss sat at the head of the table again, drink in hand, officers lined up like loyal courtiers. The slick-haired man gave me a grin as I entered, as though I were a prize they'd just broken in. The boss motioned for me to sit. Word is you had your little talk with the jogger. I nodded. He got the message. He won't be asking questions anymore. The boss's eyes narrowed, searching my face for any crack, any hesitation. I gave him none. Finally, he leaned back, satisfied. Good, you did well. I like people who handle problems quietly. He gestured, and one of the officers slid a small envelope toward me. Inside was cash, more than a month's worth of HOA dues. Consider it a thank you, the boss said smoothly. We take care of those who take care of us. I pocketed it, feigning reluctant acceptance. In truth, every dollar was potential evidence. The meeting shifted to business. They talked openly about schedules, shipments, payments, all veiled in euphemisms, but clear enough if you knew the language. The slick-haired officer rattled off dates, while the boss nodded approvingly. Then the boss turned back to me. You've proven useful. Maybe it's time you took on something bigger. My pulse quickened. This was it. The window I'd been waiting for. I forced a cautious shrug. Depends on what you're asking. The boss's grin was predatory. Tomorrow night, another delivery. Bigger than the last. We'll need extra eyes. You ride along, make sure everything goes smooth. No one outside our circle gets a look. Understood? I gave a slow nod, careful to look hesitant but compliant. Understood. The meeting ended shortly after, but as I walked out of the clubhouse, the weight of what I'd agreed to hit me full force. A ride-along meant direct involvement. It meant being seen as part of their operation. It also meant being surrounded by armed criminals who wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in me if they caught even a whiff of betrayal. But it also meant something else: access. For the first time, I'd be inside the machinery of their empire, close enough to see the gears turning, close enough to finally find the weak point where the whole thing could be ripped apart. Tomorrow night, I wasn't just going to ride along. I was going to memorize every detail, every face, every word. And when the time was right, I'd turn their empire into rubble. The next night, I climbed into the black SUV they sent for me. Two armed men flanked me, their expressions flat, their hands never straying far from their weapons. The air smelled of leather and gun oil. No one spoke as the vehicle rolled through quiet suburban streets, past sleeping houses that had no idea what evil was passing by. We pulled up to the storage compound, gates sliding open like the jaws of a beast. Inside, floodlights blazed, trucks idled, engines humming, men moving crates with mechanical efficiency. The Mafia boss stood in the center, cigar glowing, eyes sharp. He spotted me immediately and gave a nod. Good. You're here, he said. Tonight, we move more weight than ever before. If this goes smooth, we all eat good. I played the part, hands in my pockets, face unreadable. Inside, adrenaline surged. This was it. My one shot. As the men hauled crates, I memorized everything: license plates, serial numbers, faces, tattoos, accents. Every detail burned into my mind like a camera flash. Then, as the trucks began to roll out, I excused myself to the shadows. From my pocket, I slipped out a small transmitter. A bureau issue, no larger than a key fob. I pressed it against the underside of one truck, magnetic lock clicking softly into place. A tracker. Another on the second truck, another on the SUV. Three silent beacons broadcasting their location to my team. When I returned to the group, no one suspected a thing. The boss even clapped me on the shoulder. You're proving yourself. Maybe you got a future here. I forced a thin smile. Maybe. Moments later, headlights lit up the night, convoys rolling out, product heading for distribution. The Mafia boss raised his glass in a mock toast, satisfied his empire was safe. And that's when the night shattered. Floodlights cut through the compound from the perimeter, brighter than the sun. Tires screeched, engines roared, and then the air exploded with the unmistakable bark of a command. FBI, drop your weapons! Chaos erupted. Men shouted, guns raised, crates dropped. Armed agents flooded in from every direction, tactical gear gleaming under the lights. The Mafia's enforcers scrambled, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly blindsided. I drew my Glock, leveling it at the slick-haired HOA officer as he froze mid-step, clipboard slipping from his hand. Game's over, I said flatly. The boss turned, face twisting in fury as agents closed on him. For the first time, his arrogance cracked. He raised his gun, but a dozen red dots pinned him in place. He wasn't untouchable anymore. Within minutes, it was over. The compound was a sea of agents. Crates pried open, evidence bagged and cataloged. The HOA officers sat cuffed on the ground, their smug authority stripped away. And the Mafia boss, wrists bound in steel, glared at me with a hatred so deep it could burn through stone. "You," he hissed, voice trembling with rage. "You were never one of us." I holstered my weapon, stepping closer so he could see the badge I pull. It from my pocket. The gold and blue gleamed under the floodlights. "No," I said coldly. "I was the one watching you." His curses were drowned out by the roar of trucks and the clatter of evidence crates being loaded into bureau vans. The neighborhood was no longer his empire. The HOA, once feared, was now just another crime syndicate on its knees. As dawn broke, I stood at the edge of the compound, watching agents wrap up the scene. Birds were chirping, the world waking up as if nothing had happened. But for me, the war was over. The Mafia boss was in chains. The HOA's corruption was dismantled, and the quiet little suburb would finally be just that, quiet. I took one last breath of the cool morning air, the badge heavy in my pocket, and allowed myself a rare smile. Justice had moved in, and the HOA would never knock on my door again.